Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. Today, as kind of our seminar for Web 287, we're going to be talking about explaining gaps in your resume. As you are kind of working with your resumes and building your resumes over the course of the next few weeks, one of the things that you might notice is that you might have some gaps, some places where you weren't working that you need to explain. And so as we're talking about this, as we're talking about resumes, I also want to talk about this so I can prepare you for the future in terms of what you'll need to do with the gaps in the resumes. Next week, we'll talk more about tips, tricks, best practices for crafting a great resume. Before we start talking about resumes today, and gaps in your resumes, I want to draw your attention to this. And that is the Cleveland Community College mock interviews. And so let me just try to be clear, first of all, that this is not the same thing as the mock interview that we do in this class, right? For that mock interview, I like to get a little more specific. I like to ask you some more specific type questions that you might get asked in a real IT job interview. This more just kind of helps you with your interviewing skills in general and just gives you some extra practice. And I want to encourage you all to do this, right? I'm not requiring you all to do it as part of the class, but I do want to encourage you all to do it. This is an event that's hosted by the Rose Library. They do mock interviews, and they're going to be on April the 5th and 6th this year. And you can see here they have 3 different times during the day that they will be having the interviews, 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m., and 3 o'clock p.m. to 4:30 p.m. I believe you can choose to schedule whether you do like a one-on-one interview or an interview with a panel where you're interviewing with multiple people. So you can get practice in either one of those areas. And you can see you can register for it on the library website or by calling the library. I'd like to be able to do something for you all in the event that you do this, right? So what I would like for you to do is, if you do this, I'd like for you, after this happens, right after the 5th or 6th, whenever your interview it was, I'd like for you to just write me up a really short paragraph, a few sentences about your experience, who you interviewed with, how you think it went, that sort of thing. And just send it to me in an email. And if you do that, I think I can at least squeeze out some extra credit for you. So that would be a good way for us to start there. So please take advantage of this. Please do these mock interviews and sign up for them fast, because they typically go pretty quickly, right? Because they can only interview so many people at a time, and these interviews go quickly. So what I'd like to talk about today is explaining gaps in your resume. Right? And as we kind of mentioned there, while you're building your resumes, this might be one thing that you notice, that you have some gaps. You have some times that you weren't working or weren't in school or weren't doing something, right? And that's going to stand out, right? Just like it's standing out to you as you're building your resume, it's going to stand out to the hiring managers, the people that are reading your resume when you get to that point. We talked about the ATS, the applicant tracking systems last time. And gaps in your resume are something that could potentially get past that ATS, right? Because really, again, all they're looking for is that algorithmic data, the keywords, and that sort of thing. But eventually, like we said last time, a person will be looking at your resume, and they're the type They don't notice it, right? They're the hiring manager, the HR manager, and they're going to notice the gaps in your resume. And you might have the question right now, well, why do they care? Right? Why does it bother them? Why does anybody care that you have a gap in your resume? And one of the big things, right, is that, if a company is going to spend time, resources, energy on you, right, and interviewing you and hiring you, getting you onboarded, getting you trained, and then you leave. Right? Because maybe you're a habitual job hopper, or maybe you don't keep jobs long, or maybe you don't have the skills. You might be a little rusty, right, from the last time you did these things. So you have this knowledge gap there that's preventing you from, serving to the best of your potential, right? Providing the most value to this company that you can. Because at the end of the day, right, one of the things that we'll talk about is, especially when you're interviewing, the company does not care, right? And this is another big thing that we'll talk about in more depth next week for your professional summary, right? Is that the company does not care what they can do for you, right? They don't care how they can help you grow, how they can help you learn things, how, they can give you any of these advantages. They care about what you can do for them. So at the core here, right, is that whole idea, right, that they care about what you can do for them. And so if they're going to put all these resources into you because it seems like you might be able to do something for them, or, what have you there, and then you don't live up to expectations, or you leave soon after, that's a huge blow. Right? Not only is it a huge blow, but it makes you look bad. Right? And so, in a study conducted by the Society for Human Resources Management, the SHRM, they found that 67% of the times that these people were interested in employment gaps, it was to help prevent soft costs. Right? They want to check on employment gaps to cover up soft costs. And this is costs from reduced productivity, the costs that we mentioned in the first bullet point there, interviewing, training, onboarding, brain drain, and so on and so forth, right? When we're talking about brain drain here, and specifically institutional brain drain, we're talking about knowledge gaps, right? So if you're supposed to be playing a key role in the institution and you haven't worked in the industry for 10 years and you haven't been studying anything for that same amount of time, you in a critical role in the company are going to be missing a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the skills that you'd need to be able to fulfill that role. So you'd have other people trying to help pick up your slack there. So you'd have a lot of the thought work, the knowledge work that could have been dedicated to other areas, kind of dedicated to filling up your slack, taking up your slack. And then 33% of the time, it's to cover hard costs, right? And this is the recruiting, the background checks, the drug screenings, the things that actually cost the company money, that they spend money on. These things happen when they hire people who maybe are missing the skills that they need because of employment gaps. So what should you do if you have an employment gap? The first thing is to be honest. Right? It might be tempting to kind of cover up your gaps in your resume by changing dates or attempting to hide the fact that you were out of work. But at the end of the day, honesty is the best policy, right? And when somebody is interviewing you, the fact that you lied on your resume will come out quicker than anything. So you just want to go ahead and be honest up front. Don't try to lie about it. Especially, like if you're missing this knowledge, they're going to try to find out. Because at this point, you're dealing with people here, not machines anymore, right? Like, lying will get you past the machine. But the human being on the other end, especially when you get to that interview process, will be able to detect your lies. I mean, when somebody's talking to you, even if something doesn't 100% seem like a lie, if you've heard certain things enough, you kind of get a vibe, you get a feeling that this might not be what they say. So then when they go and call and check your resume and they say, well, when were they last employed? And they say, oh, well, the last time they worked here was in 2014. And you lied and said you'd been working there since, until last year or something. They're going to figure it out. That's going to put a sour taste in their mouth. Things are going to go poorly. You're not going to get that job. So you may as well be honest and just include the gaps as they are. But if the gaps are bad and they want to cover up for those gaps, how can we get around that, right? Well, the first thing is to speak to the gap. And we're going to speak to the gap in two places, right? We're first going to speak to the gap in your cover letter. If you've got a substantial gap in your employment history, go ahead and talk about it in your cover letter. Just get out ahead of it, right? That's what we're talking about here. And now we're not saying, we're not saying how deep you go into it, right? Remember, again, one of the big things that we talk about when we talk about applying for jobs and writing your resume and writing your cover letter and all this kind of stuff is that you get to curate your own story. So you get to tell them what you want to reveal, and you get to keep secret what you want to keep secret. So when we talk about speaking to the gap, you want to make sure you're identifying the time period in question, and in one or two sentences explain what caused the employment, or the break in employment, rather. And again, you don't have to go into great detail here. Maybe it was a medical concern, right? Like sometimes we have medical issues, right? That's something that happens with human beings. You don't necessarily want to go into the type of medical issue that you had and how it impacted you personally. But you might want to say that, I had a medical issue that left me unable to work. I'm fully recovered now. And then the last bullet point here is mention what you did during that time period that you weren't working that could be construed as career development. So you could say, while I was unable to work, I took a class, right? So, actually take a class, right? Don't just say that you took a class. I took a class, or I made sure to read these publications and these books to stay up to date on what was going on in my field, or whatever, right? So, because, you want to show that even though you didn't work during that time period for whatever reason, that you weren't just stagnant. You weren't just sitting at home on the couch, not trying to better yourself. You want to talk about, what you were trying to do to improve yourself during that time period, and again, tell the truth. Right? And so I think some of this here, to some degree, might be something that you can pick up and start doing from now forward. We also want to be prepared to speak to the gap during our interview. And this is where, you could go into a little more depth if you'd like. When you sit down to prepare for the interview, just take some time and create some talking points. because you can almost be guaranteed that you're going to be asked about it. Right? Especially if you identify it, doubly so if you go ahead and get out in front of it and identify it in your cover letter, right? But even if you don't, they're just going to recognize it in your resume and they're going to ask about it. So they're going to ask about it. So you just may as well go ahead and sit down and take some time to think up some talking points that, that's going to allow you to speak to your resume gaps. And one of the things that we mentioned last time is how common, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, we mentioned how common job hopping is in the IT field, right? So, well, job hopping is not considered an employment gap, but it is something that kind of falls in that same vein of might not be here long, probably shouldn't invest in them. So if you have a string of jobs where you've only stayed there for a short amount of time, 3 to 6 months, that's another thing that you kind of want to prepare yourself to explain. So if you've had a series of short-lived positions, go ahead and write those talking points out, right? Like one of the things that you think about when you're thinking about your interview, and it's something that we can talk about more in the future, is that you can almost expect a certain series of questions, and that's going to change from person to person and job to job. Like if you have gaps in your resume, or you have instances of job hopping on your resume, or things that look like job hopping on your resume, you can rest assured that somebody's going to ask about it. You can rest assured that somebody's going to ask you something like, tell me about yourself, right? These are things that you can be well aware that people are going to ask you about, and as such, you can go ahead and prepare answers ahead of time so you can come into an interview even better prepared than you might have been otherwise. So prepare to speak about the gaps during your interview. Make up for the gaps with the rest of your resume. Do something if you're out of work. Right? You can use other items to make up for your gaps. Go back to school and get a certificate or get some kind of further education, right? Even if it's just taking a few classes. If you're out of work, that's something you can do. Add some skills to yourself to make you more valuable. Freelance, right? If you're in a field that allows you to do freelancing, do some freelance hardware repair, do some freelance help desk type work, troubleshooting, hardware software repair, do some freelance website building, some freelance programming, right? Go into business for yourself and do some freelancing and talk about what you've done in your freelancing. If all else fails, get any part-time job, right? You can go to work anywhere just so people can see that you are putting in an effort to work, right? Even if it's not relevant experience. One of the things that we'll talk about next week is how we make relevant experience. So even if it doesn't seem like relevant experience, we could potentially spin it into something that is relevant to what we want to do, right? So do something else that you can put on your resume that would fill up that time that you're without work. Then that way, there might not even be a gap. Right? Because if you're back in school, that's not a gap. If you're doing other work, that's not a gap. Right? So you can use that other material to make up for your gaps. And then there's some gaps that you just don't have to worry about, right? So like if you only have like a few months worth of a gap, like 2 or 3 month gap, it's pretty short, right? Like that's a job search process. You were out looking for jobs. You were out looking for work. Nobody's going to ask about that. If it's a gap from over, 7 to 10 years ago, Nobody's going to care about that. Like if you've kept consistent employment somewhere for the last 10 to 15 years, right? Like 10 years, I guess. Anything that's really over 10 years old, people don't care as much about in interviews, right? Or in the job hiring practice. Just because the entire world changes. Like the entire world is different now than it was 10 years ago. I mean, really, for all intents and purposes, the entire world's different now than it was yesterday. Right? But especially even in your own personal life, the entire world is different than it was 10 years ago. So if it's super old or really short, don't worry about them. But when you go into your interview, you might just want to brush up a little bit about that just in case, so you can have just a little bit of preparation in the event they ask you about it. So don't just blow it off completely, but don't worry about it. Right? And so that's really all that I have for you today. Again, next week, we're going to be examining some best practices and things and do's and don'ts sort of thing for writing your resume. So before you get those all tightened up to turn in on March the 10th, we'll be covering that. If you have any questions about anything or there's anything that you want me to cover, please let me know. Don't forget you have a job application assignment due tonight. That's all that I have for you for today. I'll hang out in the chat just in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.